Hey everybody, Jayborino here, welcome back. I've completed video showcases for all 28 submissions to Maporino 2019. Thank you so much to all who participated. I had a lot of fun this year. We had some really interesting and unique submissions. Deltron is finishing up his showcase over on his channel, so you can check those out if you would like. I'm going to make a retrospective video where I go through all the submissions now that I've let them kind of sink in after I played them earlier this month and give some roundup thoughts for each one. Again, it might be different based on when I played them because that was a couple weeks ago. So I do know more about some of these submissions based on the authors being in the Discord or leaving comments under the videos, some stuff that I missed. I want to reference that type of stuff. And again, also now that it's not just me fresh playing them, I might have different thoughts or not. And this might just give some insight into how we'll be judging and just my thoughts on map making in general and what the whole point of the contest was. So I hope you stick around. It's going to be a long video. I'll try to be relatively concise for each entry, but keep in mind there were 28, so it's going to take a while to go through all of them. I may be cross-referencing other entries as I talk about them as I go through, but it's really up to you how you want to watch this video, and I'll put timestamps in a pinned comment below so you can jump around if you would like. So with that, let's turn on some music and get started. The first map that I played was submitted by Alarak, Lost Probe 2. Now, Alarak submitted last year as well, and he was runner-up, first runner-up with Lost Probe 1. Now, I think that Lost Probe 2 was actually better than Lost Probe 1, which really says something considering that Lost Probe 1 was the runner-up last year. So that says a lot about the whole contest in general. I think that we got really good submissions, and the fact that I think this submission was better than his last year, which actually was one of the winners, I think, again, just kind of says something about the contest as a whole and the quality of the submissions we got across the board. But I really, really enjoyed this. It was a little long. And Alarak did say that he added this specific section that we're looking at because he had extra time. I did add 2 weeks to the deadline. But I think this was one of the best parts, and this was one of the best puzzle parts. So if I had to give this an award, it would obviously be Best Puzzle Map, though we didn't really have other explicit puzzle maps. And so it's kind of unfair to say that this was the best puzzle map, considering you have nothing to compare it to. But, you know, in the hypothetical situation that we did, I'm pretty confident that this one would have won, because I really liked the Colossi section, which was all movement puzzles, and each individual section that made it feel like you could discover different and unique ways to solve each puzzle. And Alarak did say that, as it turned out, I did solve a lot of the puzzles as in a way that he didn't necessarily intend. But I think that's something that's important when you are making a puzzle map, is knowing and expecting the fact that players may find not necessarily exploits, but just ways to solve things that you didn't think about. But that doesn't make the solutions any less valid. But I really like this probe mirror puzzle. It was challenging, but when you figured it out, it was quite rewarding. And again, just to reiterate, I think my favorite part was the Colossi puzzle section. The boss was broken mildly. It had 2 phases. I finished the first phase legit, but then the boss was supposed to be cornered in like a no-fly zone that apparently just didn't work properly, and he floated back and ranged my cannons and I killed him. But I don't feel like that took away much from the map directly. I mean, we did have submissions that had no glitches in that way, but in terms of, you know, things that were broken, that was relatively minimal in my opinion, considering the map was quite long. I was ready for it to be over, and then so the boss floated over, I killed him. I was like, great, because that was a good time. In my opinion, that was a good time for the map to have ended anyway, though we didn't really get to see what that Tempest did. But in any case, I did like this map. The puzzles were clever, and they were rewarding to complete, and there were multiple ways to complete them, and those were big check marks in terms of having a novel puzzle map. So I think this map really accomplished what it set out to do. So we'll head on to the next one. This was Cries of the Lost, submitted by Kaitu Hacks, first-time submitter. And if I were to give an award to this one, it would probably be Best First-Time Submission, or Best Entry-Level, Best New Mapmaker Experiment, so to say. It was just a solid single-player Brood War submission. I had a good time with it. It had some narration to it. We should probably, as I start these, I should skip around so you could actually see what's going on in the maps. But it did use built-in town scripts, and I think that's honestly fine. I think there's, you know, Brood War's been out for so long that you have people doing some really incredible stuff, and I think it's easy to lose sight to what it's like to just still get started, whether it's with the vanilla editor, which isn't even shipped with remastered anymore, or SCM Draft. And so, to start, you're probably not... I said this at the end of the video when I played it, but you're not going to be using advanced scripting. You're not going to be using a lot of the interesting tools and functions that are being supplied by people who have been modding this game for a really long time. So what this map did was, it used town scripts, which, again, to some is blasphemy, but you have to think about this from the perspective of someone who's not even experimented in an editor before, right? So I think this was a really, really solid submission. It functioned pretty much perfectly. I think the difference was, I just killed my own hatchery there with that infested Terran. I think the difference was there's some missing dialogue that didn't time properly, but again, this map was functional. It did have bits of a story, so if Kaiju decides to make some other maps and just tinker around, that's how you get started. And I think there's also a misconception that everybody's first time thing is just going to be a broken mess. No, I think rather you should think more simplistically for your first thing, but that doesn't mean it's broken. And this map wasn't broken. It was fun. It was functional. And it was a little challenging at first. Obviously, it's one of those things that once you tech up, then you're just going to be able to roll over the AI, which I did end up doing. But then the idea that this Cerebrit gets pacified because the Overmind is killed and then captured by this mysterious Umojin force was interesting, and I'd like to learn more about that. And again, relatively simple. And I think we had a lot of submissions this year that could be considered, quote, simple, but don't conflate simple with bad, right? When you have something that's simple, but it functions well and is still fun to play, that's called being elegant, right? So some were more elegant than others, right? But this was one that was, again, it was basic, but it was still a blast to play. So thank you for submitting Kaiju. I'd like to see more people just messing around and making maps that don't have to be these huge experiences. They can be a basic 1 versus 2 or 1 versus 3 AI. You can use the built-in scripts. Don't let anyone make you think that you need to be diving into advanced things right away, because that is extremely discouraging, and everyone has to start somewhere. All right, on to the next map. This was Marine Fodder. Speaking of elegance, if I had to give this submission an award, it's probably not good that I'm saying I'm going to give these submissions like random awards that I'm making up on the spot, because I haven't gotten through the whole list, and I might hit something later that I'm like, oh, I got to revise that. But, it's all for fun in any case. This submission was extremely elegant, and I would say that this was probably the most elegant submission that we had. And the reason I say that it's elegant is, one, because it's a simple concept, which is you have to, wander through and dodge individual projectiles while shooting your own projectiles. It felt like just a straight-up arcade cabinet. Like, you go to the mall to an arcade. Not many of those exist anymore, but this is something that felt directly from an arcade cabinet. It was one simple but extremely well-executed idea. And it was hard. It was harder than it looked, and I feel like it was probably one of those types of maps where watching it was insufferable, but then you want to go play it yourself, and when you do, you might realize that it's a lot harder than it seems. And again, to speak about the elegance, the reason that I say that is because it's simple. It's one particular concept, right? And then it's building things around it, and that obviously you're not building, you don't have any sort of resources besides your health, and I guess there was ammunition, but that never was really an issue for us. But it was probably the most well-executed, clean experience around one unique idea. And so he had to build the system with the projectiles, but then also balance everything around it. And none of the enemies felt like bullshit, except maybe at the very excuse me, maybe at the very, very end, where I got hit by a spider mine. Like, how was I supposed to dodge that? I don't know. Maybe there was a way. But regardless, we didn't play through the very end. We probably could have. But, it's one of those where it really feels like you're making progress. You think, okay, it's such a simple concept, and yet the more you play it, the more you realize, oh, I am getting better, or yes, I am learning what each of these enemies do, and you're able to proceed, even though there is only one core mechanic. And I think that it was just executed extremely well. Those stalker projectiles were pretty hard to dodge. But overall, I really don't have anything negative to say, except for the fact that, I did get killed by a spider mine. But it's the type of map where I don't really care about, like, individual encounters feeling like bullshit, because you die so quickly, and it's built around respawning quickly and trying different things. If anything, maybe just having there being lives at all maybe isn't necessary, but that does make it feel more like an arcade cabinet in that way, I suppose. So again, this definitely feels extremely arcadey. We had maybe 2 or 3 other submissions that were like that as well, and this one I think was the best in terms of elegant execution. All right, on to the next one. By the way, this was called Marine Fodder by Matic. I just started talking about it. All right, here was Raising of the Axe by Seven Blood, also first-time submitter, though I believe Seven Blood has experience with making maps, just none that I have played in the past. This was a Tauren custom race. Let's just go ahead and skip forward to maybe when we're attacking and we have a large group of Tauren. So this contained a Tauren custom faction. Now, what I don't know, we had a lot of custom factions this year. A lot of custom factions this year. A lot of it was based around custom tech trees. I should call them custom tech trees. You know, visual assets, interesting ideas. And in Warcraft 3, typically, the way it's all based around what you're substituting for different roles, right? The Tauren faction here still had a tier 1 melee unit, a tier 1.5 ranged unit. You had 2 or 3 casters. I think there were 3 casters. You still had spirit walkers, but then you had the druids and the shaman, which were really, really good. And so the challenge with playing maps like these, or showcasing them, I should say, is ensuring that I show enough of the race while also still winning. So I have to kind of gauge, like, how hard is this map going to be right at the beginning? Because if I misjudge it, then suddenly I'm like, okay, well, I got to tech up to show all this stuff, without realizing that I needed to put in way, way, way more effort in order to actually win, which would have required me to not really mess around as much. And I think that's a key that this map did well, as did many others, which I'll touch on as I get to them, which is, if you're introducing a new race, you want to give especially in like a one-time map experience, you want to give the player an opportunity to actually utilize stuff without being just strangled. You know, take the boot off their throat, only because you have to recognize that, you know, you're submitting this to a contest. This is the only experience I have with your race. With your custom race, custom tech tree. So you have to keep that in mind as part of the map design, which is, if you absolutely drown me in enemies and enemy waves, I'm going to do the bare minimum just to win, as opposed to doing the best I can to showcase. And that's up to you, right? That doesn't necessarily mean you have to allow me to be able to see them all. But if you feel like the allure of your map is the fact that it's a custom tech tree, I think it's best to make sure that you design it in a way that does allow the player, maybe I should say accessibility should be a bit more important, in the sense that you're appealing to more of a normal skill level. This map did have a normal and a hard difficulty. I played everything on normal when I had the opportunity across the submissions, and I liked a lot about this map. I do think that the amount of Centaur camps could have been reduced. Once you killed the first 2 or 3, there were really no more threats on the map. So in that sense, it did feel perhaps a bit bloated. I said that about another submission as well. So I guess I'll be saying that in terms of criticism for a lot of these when they felt too long and they didn't necessarily have to be. What I really liked about this map was the choice outcome, and it was a choice that actually had a direct impact on the gameplay. Pretty much all the optional objectives did, and there was a hidden optional objective where you could find dead dwarves, and you could take their guns, and you could make a Tauren with a gun. I found that a little too late into the map, so maybe make that as its own optional objective, though I think it was just meant to be an Easter egg secret. But the issue with the side objectives, as well as the hidden dwarven gun, is that you might find them too late. So, like, what I really liked was the fact that there was a choice that you could get Chaos Taurens. The thing was, by the time you find that, you didn't necessarily need it. So I think posing that to the player earlier might be more interesting, because especially this bottom left base that was down here, it was really putting the hurt on really, really early. So maybe activate the second Centaur base or third Centaur base a little earlier. Basically, the challenge of this felt good early, and I would have probably taken the Chaos Taurens if the question was posed to me earlier. But then once I killed the first Tauren, the Centaur camp, and then especially the second one, the map felt like it was effectively over. So you can either remove some of the later Centaur camps just to reduce the bloat, or you could make it so that you have to make a design with the AI scripting, with the attack waves, what have you, such that it becomes harder over time faster, so that way the player can't just overcome it that quick. Now, I realized I was playing on normal, so, I mean, there's really not much to say. The other thing with the terraining is getting up to the Harpies required going up this really, really long, windy road, and then it took me a while to get back down, too. So, the only negative thing I have to say about this map was the fact that it felt longer than it necessarily had to be, but at the same time, I'm kind of eating my own words, because I basically said you want to give the player an opportunity to experiment, so that extra time did allow me to build up more. I realized I didn't build a bestiary to show off some of those. There were Kodos and perhaps 1 or 2 other things, but I don't think it was anything as interesting as the casters. I really like the shaman with the totems, and that you could get an upgrade that allowed the totems to scale with your +1, 2, 3, which was pretty cool. So overall, this was an excellent entrance into a custom tech tree, because this was the first one I played that had the, I don't want to call it's not a total conversion, right? But it's a tech tree overhaul, and I thought it did a really, really good job at that. We had some interesting heroes. I didn't use the lion because apparently it had a chance to bug, and I did run into one crash, not the end of the world at the end of the day, especially because it happened pretty early. But yeah, this was one of my favorite submissions, I think, just because it was solid. It was a tech tree overhaul that felt really, really solid, albeit could have been shorter. It just, I don't mind longer submissions. You know, that's going to be a recurring theme. A lot of these were really long. And I don't mind the fact when stuff is really long, but sometimes it feels like it's unnecessarily long. And that's something you just have to judge for yourself, I suppose, when you're making the maps. All right, on to the next one. This was Death Fortress by Freezing Acid Rain. This was, this uses, it's called the Reforged mod. I believe you can find it on Battle.net, and when you download this map, yeah, it's definitely on Battle.net, because rather than being packed with the map, you can download it when you want to launch the map within the editor. You download it from Battle.net in order to do that. So this was an infested Terran faction. It's very similar to Stukov in co-op, which is exactly why I made the mistake of missing some stuff. There were some units that I thought I couldn't make, like some of the infantry, because the infested civilians morphed into that infantry, and I mean, sometimes it seems obvious to you, the viewer, but when I'm commentating and I'm playing, I just make mistakes, and I just don't see stuff that might seem like it's right in front of my face, because I've already made, my brain has already made the connection of, oh, well, I can't make the volatile infested because I would expect it can be built from the barracks, and then it just never really clicked that, oh, there was a grayed out button under the infested civilian to morph them into other ones, because my brain had already made the decision, okay, those are unavailable. And also because I had expectations set by the Stukov custom commander, or co-op commander, rather. And that's part of the problem here, is because, again, it draws too much from expectations from an existing co-op commander, that if you don't follow those lines too closely, then the player's going to have maligned expectations, which is what I had, which is why I made the mistake that I did. And it was my fault. I'm just saying that there are things that as a mapmaker you could do that a mapmaker can do to help guide the player a bit better, right? So I'm not trying to say that I didn't make a mistake. I recognize that. I'm trying to just give feedback on what a mapmaker could do to ensure that other people don't make the same mistake that I did, rather than simply, be blind. Because again, I recognize when I make mistakes, but I think that there are some design things that could help alleviate some of the common mistakes that the player may end up making, because it's not some things that might not be telegraphed to them. And it's my job, I think, as a showcaser, to try to parse, like, where did I just make a really stupid mistake versus where could the designer, where they didn't necessarily make a mistake, but where could they make an improvement to just help guide the player better so that they don't do the same thing I did. But this map, I think, was an interesting one, and I simply think that the cannons, what I mentioned when I played it is the cannons simply just don't even need to exist, period, because they do so much damage, and even if I knew that I could make that special infested infantry, it wouldn't have mattered because it would have died so quickly anyway. I ended up making the bunkers, which were really cool because you could load them and then the guys inside of them would shoot while they were moving, which was just excellent. I really like these bunkers, but the fact is they're the only things that could have survived the big cannon shots. So I think that the design of the map, one thing that I got, this is what I learned after I played it, not just the infantry morphs, but someone made a suggestion, which was, you don't need to remove the cannons, but telegraph where they're going to shoot, and give the player 2 to 3 seconds or more in-game, the timer moves a little faster, to actually move out of the way. Rather than, once they shoot, you don't see it coming, your whole army just gets nuked. So I just ended up building the bunkers, and that was all I used to win, which was fine because they are fun, but I think that could have been improved upon to let me play around with some of these cool choices a bit more. The AI also really aggressively rebuilt, which isn't necessary. That's more of just a personal, that's just a personal preference of mine. Obviously, someone who was just more diligent than I could have moved up and make sure they were setting up bunkers or setting up tanks to ensure that those probes weren't getting where they needed to go in order to rebuild stuff. So I get that. That you don't have to necessarily change that, but I think that there are ways that you can mitigate for that if you'd like to, which is to make all the factions a different color, a different faction. There were 5 or 6 bases, make them all different factions so that they only rebuild their individual bases as opposed to each other You know, there isn't a probe from the upper right coming down trying to rebuild the bottom left, for example. But overall, this was a cool faction. It changed more things than I noticed when I played it, so that was my fault, and I wish I would have been able to experiment a little more, though I sort of just gave up with experimenting because of the cannon, like you just saw there. There's pretty much no way to avoid that any more than I had done. Alright, on to the next one. Nice work, Freezing Acid Rain. This was AWS Faction Wars, submitted by Dudekey SC2. I played this... This was co-op submission with Deltron. This was another tech tree overhaul, and I am super impressed with the amount of work that Dudekey has put in to make all of these different factions. I'm glad that I started the video, and this is where we ended up, so you can see that every faction, and I believe that there are 6, with a 7th being added. I may be incorrect there, but there's a lot. There are several, and each one not only has individual customized units, but also customized upgrades that you can apply. And you can see me going through and picking all of these, and there were so many. And part of the challenge with showcasing here is deciding how much time should I spend showing off each of these individual things, because I'm obviously only able to play 1 or 2 of the factions, and then each one has upgrades inside of those. And it would take a really long time not only to go through each of the individual units and the upgrades, but then also backing up and saying, here are all the factions, and here are all the units within that faction. But what I really liked about this map was the fact that it was dynamically... it was just dynamic, and it was randomly generated. Not super random, right? There were enemy bases around, but the key was that the objective could change. So there was a lot of replayability, so if you wanted to try out the different factions, you had a relatively concise experience. You don't have to play it co-op, though I would recommend it. That's one thing I would recommend as part of this, is make it so that the enemy AI or attack waves are more dynamic based on if you're playing solo or not, because I would not recommend anyone play this by themselves. As far as I can tell, it's super challenging by if you're playing alone. Though Dudekey can correct me if I'm incorrect there, but I believe I also saw a comment on my Discord of someone who tried to play it by themselves, and they just got absolutely slaughtered, having to take on all of the enemies by themselves. But what is cool is that you're playing these 2 factions, and then it randomly assigns who you're playing against. So there are like 4 or 5 enemy bases around the map, maybe more. So you have an opportunity to see what the other factions are, even though you may not have picked them to play. So, again, we didn't have an opportunity to play all of them, but it felt relatively balanced. I liked how I could turn my supply depots into, I'm mousing over it right now, you can see, into these different defensive structures, which I thought was really excellent. The issue, again, like I said, is we didn't really have an opportunity to play all of them, but that's more contest-related versus design-related. So I'm judging based on the contest, right? I have to. It's the whole point. But that doesn't mean that this, I thought, was too much, right? It was too much for a contest map because there was simply no way we could get to everything. But if anything, that made me want to experience more of it. And I'm really excited because Dudekey made Annihilation, he made a bunch of maps for that, and he's moving on to a war story here, so I'm really looking forward to seeing what there is to add. And if there was a theme that we inadvertently got this year as part of Maporino, it was definitely the What's Next theme, which is almost every map left me wanting more or asking questions and wanting to see more. Like, I felt either it was on the individual map feeling like there was more that I could have found, or they were part of a campaign or an existing project that I know more is coming. And almost every map had that, which was just excellent. And this map, I think, exemplified that the most, which is there's just so much. There's just so much to this project, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where it goes. So if I had to give this one its own little award, it would probably be just the wanting to see more from a project perspective, because it just seems so expansive, and he's put in so much work to just design this core mechanic, and he made an interesting map around it, which was, again, dynamic, randomly generated to an extent, and allowed you to mess around, which was great for replayability. Alright, on to the next one. Legacy of Wolves, Duke Phoenix. Duke Phoenix was a first-time submitter. I really enjoyed this map. You know what, I would give this a tie with Kai2 Hax's submission, which was best first-time submitter, or first-time tinkerer in the editor. And I like this map because it clearly drew inspiration from existing custom maps from Legends of Arcane in particular, just in terms of the names and some of the hero abilities. But it was a solid first-time submission. And a lot of the points that I had already talked about with Cries of the Lost from Kai2 Hax applies to this one too, which is I think people might worry too much about the first things that they're making, especially if they know that I'm going to play it and you're going to have an audience of people watching. Right, and that's hard. There's not much advice I can give around that besides you're never going to be able to make something more advanced unless you become comfortable with where you're starting. And if there are other people who are making you feel uncomfortable about where you're starting, then you have to be judicial about taking feedback from those people. And, it's unfortunately the internet, and you just have an open audience, so sometimes you're going to have people who insist you have to do things one way. I vastly disagree. I think that, the first time projects should have the most leeway, the most flexibility in basically making sure that you have to understand your tool. And that's what your first project, your first map rather, is going to be. And this definitely felt like a good first-time submission. I liked the voice acting. I liked the foundation for where this campaign could go, because it's part of... Well, was this map called... I think the campaign is called Legacy of Wolves. I just didn't have it in the title here, what the actual map was called. But there's meant to be more here. And really in Warcraft 3, I'm at the point where I like seeing interesting heroes and interesting tech trees. And so anytime that you're introducing different units, even if they're modified only slightly, just making the player rethink on how those roles fit. This was a micro mission, so, we had these different melee units with the halberds and different footmen, and you had these archers with the searing arrows, and anything that varies it up a little bit from just, it's an archer, it's a rifleman, right? It's a footman. They might be slightly different, their stats are different, they have different abilities. This hero was way too strong, in my opinion, and I did learn after the fact that for the Maporino submission, he allowed the hero to get up to... I think max level, or at least level 6 to get his ultimate, which provided like a 90% damage buff or something like that. Something crazy, like a huge command aura. And that was only for the Maporino submission, just to show off the hero, as opposed to the map where he's only supposed to get to level 4 or 5, so you wouldn't get that. So that makes a big difference with, how I think about in terms of balance. It's imbalanced for the contest submission, but it was done purposefully to ensure that you could see what he had, as opposed to, balancing the map. And again, it was a first-time submission, so, I can't really harp on the terrain. The terrain needed more detailing. But again, foundationally, it was solid. I think a lot of maps, I talked about this when I played it, which is when you look at the mini-map after you've completed it, you should see a general flow to the map as opposed to a big amorphous blob with the terraining, with the different levels of terrain being unreadable. Having just like a centralized path, whether it's a road or a path through the trees or what have you, you should be able to kind of understand, just by looking at the mini-map, just kind of understand the reading of the terrain, and this map had that. Also, I found this little Easter egg with the troll that you could kill him, and then it makes you feel bad for killing him because he's neutral to you. Fun little things like that. So I think Duke Phoenix, you did a great job with this, and I'm happy to see that you're still sticking with it. And we'll look forward to where this campaign or project continues to go. All right, on to the next one. Seizure of Systems by Razorback9425. This was, I would say, an actual total conversion. All the units were different. A lot of them were like mashed up existing assets. Let's go ahead and skip forward. And what this map did really well is it had a nice wrapping around the custom tech tree. So this is what I keep talking about in terms of the custom tech trees. Ooh, just big nuke right there. You saw all my stuff exploded there. But the map was not easy, but it gave you a lot of time at the beginning to get situated, and I appreciate that. And that's what I had talked about earlier in the Tauren custom map, Raising of the Axe, which is, if you're gonna throw all of this stuff at the player, either there needs to be stuff that's semi-familiar that they can react to, or you need to give them a lot of time and a lot of breathing room to kind of just get situated. Now this, I believe, is part of a campaign and a project, and this was pretty far into it. So I think, for example, those big Reaver-like creatures that were part of the objective to not let them die, I don't think those were even supposed to be in this map originally. I think those are there just to show the player that they exist as part of the contest. So similar to what I was saying in the last map, where the hero had his level 6 ability when he technically shouldn't have for the balance of the map, I think it's the same with these things that we're looking at here. I think they were called bastions. You don't get those in the normal map, or in any case, they're there really only to show that they exist as opposed to being able to build them. It being an objective that they have to survive could be missed pretty easily by players, I suppose. It is talked about in the briefing, but I do think the briefing was a bit long, a bit bloated. There was a lot of exposition and a lot of talking, but I did think that I don't know if I'd call it voice acting, but the text-to-speech was fitting for this faction, and I liked just the idea of the fully robotic faction. It was a little confusing to see that their Tier 1 unit was a probe. I think that model could be changed, at least slightly, because every time I saw them, I immediately associate them with being workers. Versus the Dragoons, which are spider droids in this, that function very, very, very similar to Dragoons. They were more like Dragoons than anything else. You know, they did different damage types for ground versus air, I understand that. So they weren't necessarily Dragoons, but they basically function like Dragoons. So when I looked at it, I see Dragoon, and it's going to fill the role that a Dragoon normally does. Whereas the probes was opposite. I didn't build many of them just because I just felt like my muscle memory and just immediate thought process associated them with workers, and it was odd. But overall, I liked how there were two different bases, and they had little map events where you had to destroy the control ship, and then you got control of them. And like the brown base was huge anti-ground, and the white base was huge anti-air. And I thought that was neat. Or it might have been opposite, but one was ground-focused and one was air-focused, right? And then you could take over their bases, and then you had an allied AI. So there was scripting on this map that made it more complex. I don't know how much involvement Razorback had on that directly, because I know he thanked iQuare for help with the custom scripts. I didn't run into any crashes, but there was a warning that there might be crashes. Also, there was like a help file for the campaign that described what some of the units did, or most of the units did, which was helpful because of the total conversion. But even in the map itself, you had a lot of time to kind of get situated. You could build one of everything and see what they did, and it wasn't overbearing, though obviously it picked up and became a lot harder. The enemy bases were challenging to get into. They functioned pretty dynamically in helping you overcome in stopping you, rather, from overcoming those bases, but at the same time, you could sit in your base and turtle up. There are plenty of resources around the map to allow you to get situated and tinker. So this fulfilled that purpose of having a tech tree to mess around with and having that time, but also still being hard and entertaining. I do know the Razorback, the creator, left a comment saying you could beat this exclusively making those raptors. That's just not how I play, though. Like, just because you can do something super optimally, I don't know, if you've watched me enough, you realize I typically don't do that. I try, if given the opportunity, to mess around and try different stuff. I won't just make one of, just one unit and build 20 of them and then go and win. So just because a map allows for that, to me, isn't necessarily a downside. Perhaps that's a balance issue that you want to think about with the race or the map itself with the enemy defenses, but, if you can make one of a single high-powered unit, that's always been a staple of many real-time strategies, which is you build a super unit, you build enough of it, and literally nothing can stop it. I don't think that's necessarily an issue with this map. It's probably just an issue with a lot of games in general, right? And I think it's purposeful. I think it's purposeful, so I'm not going to say just because I could have built Raptors to win doesn't mean the map was easy. I don't think so. That's just my opinion. And they were relatively expensive. You could probably just increase the cost if they were that good. Alright, so really good job, Razorback. Again, what I liked about this one was the fact that the difficulty was dynamic enough that allowed you to get situated, but still kept up a major challenge towards the end. I like the custom music and the custom sound effects. Some of them were a little overbearing, but for the most part, I appreciate the attempt to make it different and fitting for like a robotic race, and I think I did a good job with that. And overall, the exposition could probably be lighter, but at the same time, this was part of a campaign that's meant to be continuing a story, and I had no context for that, so I can't really hold that against the map. And overall, this was a fun one. So on to the next one. This is Fellowship of Darkness by Lux. If I had an award for this one, I could say right off the bat, this was the best use of music of any of the submissions. Really good use of custom music. You could definitely... I think it's just vast... It's just criminally underused. That's hyperbole. But this map, I had no idea what was going on. But I figured it out. It wasn't so confusing that I couldn't figure out the context. This was a holdout map for the most part until the end, where you had to destroy the enemy bases. There was some bloat. I think the timer could have been cut down significantly, because once I got to a certain time period, I was like, all right, this is it. I don't need to continue doing this. So either make the timer shorter or give the player a bit more breathing room so that they can move out and actually destroy some of those incoming enemy bases getting set up. And you couldn't even permanently destroy them in the first place. It was only temporary in any case. So I think Lux had already addressed some of these issues that I had brought up when I played on the latest version that's on the arcade. I did not play on the arcade just because I wanted the opportunity to quick save. That's just a habit of mine. If I have the opportunity to play locally, I will. But I understand that I do understand that the arcade version was more up to date, and I think he had incorporated some changes that I had talked about already in my showcase of this. But again, I think it's different per person. This is definitely subjective. So like, I really like the music here, and I feel like it had a big impact on the map. Some people might like the music and acknowledge it was a good addition, but it might not give them that same. It might not have the same like mild emotional impact that it did for me. And again, I think that's something that ends up being extremely subjective. But I will say, for me, I think custom music more often than not has a positive impact. But I also acknowledge that it won't necessarily. Sometimes it could just be really poorly chosen. But there have been very rare situations where I've heard the music and thought, oh, this was not a good fit. Most of the time, it's usually used well, and this one did really well. But again, the only negative here is that I think it was, there was some mild bloat. I think a lot of the air blockers have been fixed in the latest version, but just in terms of, for the submission itself, I think this was one where I definitely covered a lot of my positives and negatives pretty well in the showcase itself, and I'm really looking forward to playing the rest of Invicta. It is on the arcade and on SC2 Mapster, though apparently the arcade version is the one that gets updated earlier, so if there are any new maps, you probably just want to play in the arcade because that's where they're getting updated the most. I also liked how this custom faction worked. It was familiar enough that I didn't feel overwhelmed by any of the changes or felt the need to have a bunch of extra time. I didn't feel like there was a necessity for extra time in order to learn it. And I liked how you could get one really high-priced upgrade and it just directly upgraded like normal units to sort of like a demi-hero type status. I thought that was really cool. And the last thing, which was, I think, something that's already been addressed, is, don't mislead the player into thinking they can't accomplish something when it's virtually impossible. Especially because I was playing on normal. I wasn't even on, like, a hard or brutal difficulty. This was listed as the normal difficulty, and I definitely felt like there was no way I could get out of my base until the end. Even when I had a full 100 army, or whatever you were capped at here, I think it might have been 150, even when I was capped, I did not feel comfortable to leave the base, because when I tried at the beginning, the amount of units that were there made me feel like I needed a very large army while also leaving enough at home to continue defending against the constant waves. This just felt like a really, really solid, suffocating holdup map, and it really did a good job accomplishing that. Alright, on to the next one. Trench Warfare by Rossville Dillon. So this was a continuation of his Liberation mod, where we had a map in 2018 as well. And unfortunately, I think this map just had a number of triggering issues, and there was more that was supposed to happen that I believe he removed either because of time or a variety of issues, I'm not sure. But there were things I liked on this map. The problem is you have to kind of ignore the bugs and the glitches and the odd design choices to see them. So, but let's tease those out. Number one, I liked the major difference between the mech and the infantry. It felt more command and conquer-y, which to see in StarCraft and make the player rethink how they play in StarCraft, I think was done really well. Infantry just did not do particularly well against mech, but you needed mech versus mech. Again, that's very command and conquer-y in a number of ways, and I liked that. Again, anything that makes the player kind of rethink how they approach this stuff is cool. And I really like this custom faction, and I believe he had mentioned that he had planned on adding a macro portion, because that was my feedback from 2018 as well, which is, I like this faction, it seems really interesting and plays cool, and it seems clean. The problem is the map built around it doesn't give you that opportunity to mess around with it, and I think he just didn't have the opportunity to incorporate that. Also, it was, the ending was definitely a gotcha moment. I think the spawning Zerg units were way over the top and didn't give the player an opportunity to actually win. And I think this trench control idea could have had more mechanics to it to make it actually impactful, so that, like, whoever was controlling the trench maybe should have gotten some better, I don't know, something else. So if there was a macro mechanic, maybe the number of trenches you controlled gave you some sort of passive resource boost. I don't know, something like that could certainly have made this more engaging, rather than just, weaving through the trenches. But, this is one of those where it's very easy to point out what's wrong with it, but I think it's important to point out what is right with it, so that, you know, as more maps are made with this mod, you know, it's not necessarily about the outcome of this map, but more the project itself. So this is one where, again, the theme is, you know, wanting more, wanting to see what's next. This mod just seems really interesting to me. And I don't like it just for the sake of, you know, changes for changes. I think that the faction itself seems really solid, but, you know, we're not really given the opportunity to tinker with it as much as I would have liked. But yeah, we've got some interesting units all around here. Little Easter eggs with Jayborino and Deltron and Acethan and stuff like that. Little voice lines, stuff like that. So that was cool to see. All right, on to the next one. Dawn's End by Earl's Good. So this is part of a campaign, and this was co-op that I played with Deltron, and this map, I'm going to skip to maybe a spot later on here. This map had a lot on it, just a lot on it. And we did lose, and I believe there was an opportunity for us to restart it and watch it as a party to replay from the replay. I didn't even realize that was possible. I thought you could only do that solo. So while we did lose and I replayed from replay, we could have done that cooperatively. So that was something I learned later on. This map was very overwhelming, just in the case of there being so much stuff on it. Not just stuff that we could do as players, but stuff that the enemy had as well. And I would compare this to, like, Lux's submission, where, like, more and more and more and more enemy factions come to the planet, but it, you know, to kind of increase that suffocating hold on your holdout section. But they didn't, they weren't so vastly different that you felt like you had to change what you were doing per se. They were just there to increase the challenge of the map without increasing the complexity of the map. Whereas this, I think the complexity increased as more and more enemies made themselves known. So there were little things here. They're like the Tau Cruiser, just bolted straight for your main structure, and if that died, you lost. So I think that more could have simply just been telegraphed to the player on this. One thing that I realize now after it's over is that we could have made more Dark Archons using the Void Templar, which, again, that's just, you know, toying with my expectations. I made a poor read of the map there, which was, you know, I was supposed to make more of those, because there were so many unique and powerful enemy units. I think the idea of this map was you're supposed to just be mind controlling all of them, and I thought we were restricted to 2 Dark Archons. Incorrect. We were supposed to make way more, and I didn't do that. So that was struggle, and again, that was more my problem for not seeing that. Neither did Deltron. And I like the idea of, again, this was later in the campaign, and even though I don't know the context of it, I can kind of understand what's happening here, and I also like to infer that, you know, there were missions that introduced all of these different factions at some point. And now they're all just smashing you and trying to destroy your base from different directions. But yeah, overall, you know, we weren't able to quite win, but this map was a lot. that was really the takeaway. There's a lot. This mod contains a lot of stuff. So it'd be interesting to pick apart, but not in one map. All right, on to the next one. The Clone War by William J. I don't have much to say on this. There were some broken things. This definitely felt like an introductory map. I think this might have been one where I think for a first map, he tried maybe to do too much, which, you know, it's hard to say that because it's a simple map already. But this is kind of what I was talking about earlier is, you know, you gotta maybe try, you gotta, like baby's first map, you gotta start somewhere, and this map maybe tried to take one leap too far, just a small one. This is like the smallest extra leap they could have taken as opposed to starting just the, you know, bit simpler. You know, the Arbiters were cool. The fact that there was a top bar was interesting, but I think one of the abilities didn't even work. And then there were findables on the map, which I really appreciate because I like events and stuff. But overall, yeah, this definitely felt like a first-time map. It looked fine. I'm not sure if this used a melee map or not. I think the terrain was fine. But yeah, and it was timed, which was interesting. I don't know if it necessarily needed to be or not, but there was clearly something here. But it wasn't fully realized. And I think that's fine. I think it could have been simpler in order to have a more solid experience, or simply take more time to flesh out the concepts that you have here, which is, you know, make sure the top bar works if you're going to provide it. I think it looks fine, and just the idea of adding some extra mechanics to the player is nice. And the Arbiters were cool, how you could deploy them and they could, like, shoot like Liberators. I thought that was really interesting. But overall, yeah, this map it came and gone very quick, and it was just sort of confusing, I think, on what was trying to be accomplished with it. But that doesn't mean that it should be discarded. I think that this was a good foundational idea, and just build upon it and make sure that it stays solid. And maybe associated with some other maps to maybe contextualize it. Maybe there were more and I didn't know about it. I'm not sure. All right, on to the next one. Nemesis Stormborn. This was Iquares and Pronagos. This used... Okay, so just to jump right into it, I think the core flaw here was this map. As I said at the end of when we played it, it reached for the stars and simply couldn't get there. I think not based on the amount of time and effort put into it and the planning, but just StarCraft Brood War and also having to use iCup. Having a huge lag, like a noticeable half-second to a full second lag time between issuing commands is extremely noticeable and takes a lot away. Now, keep in mind, you can play this. You don't have to play with other people. You can play by yourself, and you'll have 2 scripted AI allies. And that's the strongest part of the map, is the fact that it can dynamically accommodate for the fact that you want to play with 1, 2, or 3 people. But again, playing online, it really has nothing to do with the design of the map. It's just the fact that it wanted to accomplish something, and iCup couldn't really support it, and Brood War itself couldn't really support it with the existing tools that I know iQuare is looking on extending. But... you know, the amount of AI commands issued at once, the cap was reached, and that can cause, basically ended up with the map being easier than they had planned on it being. And this is a map also where I know a lot about it, which is a double-edged sword, because I have to judge it based on what we played and not what I think the map was supposed to be. But, you know, to discuss some of the things, again, it was supposed to be more challenging, but it just couldn't get there because of CCMU cannot create more units, and just the unit, the command AI commands limit being reached. The things that this campaign did really interesting was, you know, again, having fully scripted AI, the fact that it could kind of accommodate for additional 1, 2, or 3 players, and there were custom tiles all throughout it. Now, I think that's excellent. The difference, though, is, you know, what effect is that really having on the map? And this is... I think that kind of gets to the core of the issue with the map in general, which is complexity under the covers does not necessarily translate into things that the player interacts with in any way. I think there is so much going on in this map that we never saw, but that doesn't necessarily make the map better because of it, right? I think the map is judged from a contest perspective based on what we can see and what we're dealing with. At the same time, I think this map was supposed to reward early aggression. I discussed this when we played it. It's not really the map's fault. It's just expectations where, you know, when you don't know whether you should be pushing out early or not, players are going to probably end up being more conservative because they don't want to be punished, and you can play safe in your base and build defense, because most maps typically do punish you for early aggression. The vanilla maps do, and most user-generated content does. And I don't think there's necessarily a good way to do that one way or the other. This map... was meant to take place as Eye of the Storm. It's a variant of Eye of the Storm, so it borrows from the narrative of the existing game, which clearly takes place at the end of StarCraft. So this kind of throws you in, and it was a good situation of where, like, you know, we got a lot of really interesting stuff, but you don't have much time to really experience it or mess around, because it's a challenging map, as it should be, because it's supposed to take place at the end. So this Hydra project is really, really interesting, and I think it has a long way to go with what they're trying to accomplish based on my conversations with iQuare, and I look forward to checking it out. But again, I think this map just isn't quite there simply because the contest time frame. And again, I think one of the key takeaways, both for the contest and also the project in general, is, again, that idea that complexity under the covers, you know, how the sausage is made, having more of that does not necessarily add to your map. And really, it's just sort of understanding and thinking about, again, you could have... we have these extra factions up at the top that are scripted to do all this crazy stuff, but it doesn't necessarily affect you directly with the enemy attack waves, per se. There was another Zerg faction on this map. I don't even know what it did or what it was for, but I'm sure that a ton of work was put into conceptualizing it and building it. It had virtually no impact. So I think there's a good amount of stuff like that around this, but this is also a map where, as I mentioned when I played it, which is, I think getting into an observer slot and just watching all of them do what they're doing would be way more interesting, because then you can kind of explore that different stuff, and that would be neat. All right, on to the next one. This was Lumen by Eclipse, and this was another good example of something that it felt like just an arcade cabinet straight up, which I thought was really cool. Let's maybe go into when we were the Ire system, because I thought that was the best area that we were in. This map, I'm embarrassed to say it took me so long to figure out what the heck to do or how to change weapons. That really impacted what I thought of it when I played it. And, you know, looking back now, I probably could have completed it and checked out all the different systems if I had learned how to change weapons at the time. And I didn't, because that was stupid of me, but it was just, rather than pressing mouse wheel, it was just, you scrolled the mouse wheel and it changed your weapons. But once I figured that out, I think that the experience opened up a lot for me. This was cool just because there were so many different systems and a lot of different enemy types. What I didn't particularly care for was the control scheme, coupled with how the enemies and projectiles functioned. I think with twin-stick shooters or shooters in general like this, like top-down shooters, is you can either choose to have it so that your forward key, W in this case, moves your ship forward in the direction it's currently facing, or you can have it consistently always move you towards the top of the screen, right? So keep that in mind as I talk about this and you know, one versus the other, because I've played different games that utilize both, and there isn't necessarily the right way to do it. But I do think that if you're going to have it such that W moves you forward based on the direction you're facing, then what it needs to be is the enemy projectiles need to be more avoidable. And the enemy projectiles in this were extremely fast. So if the enemy projectiles aren't slower and avoidable, I think that you need to allow more consistent movement in the other way that I had discussed, so that the player can move and shoot more effectively. But if you're making it so that they can only shoot in the direction they're facing, but also move in the direction that they're facing, then make it so that the projectiles are more dodgeable, and that would make for a lot more of a digestible experience. But this was an interesting map because there were a lot of interesting events that weren't explained, and I'm not saying that negatively. I think that was good. You know, like, oh, there's weird cargo ships that you can destroy to get extra money, and you'd think that you see those, and it's not an objective, but you're like, oh, I can kill these things and get money, but then the police will spawn and try to kill you too. So I thought that was cool, and you know, there was an end point that I was actually close to, but I didn't realize that would be the actual end. But I think that the control scheme was good. It's more the, you know, make the enemy projectiles slower to compensate for it. And I like the fact that there were so many different systems you could go to. But this was one where, again, it was elegant, and I think the execution could be tinkered with just slightly in terms of the, you know, the movement and the enemy projectiles, etc., etc. But it functioned great. There were no bugs. I do think that the transitioning from system to system, I don't have an answer to this, but I think you could brainstorm on how to make that different so that maybe a confirmation comes up that says, do you want to leave the system? Because you might be fighting an enemy and you're trying to strafe away from it, and then you just warp into the other system. And then you still lost all that HP, but the enemy will reset when you go back to the system. So, you know, relatively minor thing, but that did happen to me a couple times. But I had fun with this one, and again, I wish in retrospect I would have finished it because I was closer to the end than I realized. All right, on to the next one. The Midas Company by Azure Guy. This was another overhaul, and I thought he did a good job with this. I do think that this faction was lacking like a solid frontline support unit, like a knight type unit or an abomination, because your melee units really just couldn't compensate for what you had to deal with. I thought the tanks were really cool, though. That was probably my favorite part. Was the tanks that you can get. My favorite part of the faction. My favorite part of the map is how the hero units work, and the implication that in each standalone scenario that are kind of stitched together just by the fact that you're like a mercenary company, is that you can pick a different hero every mission, and then you just have to upgrade them, or level them up, rather, in each individual mission, which I think is cool, because that way you can kind of pick according to the... Maybe if there was more of like a briefing or an entry to kind of give you an idea of what you're up against, and then make the heroes more adaptable in that way, so that you know, based on what I'm facing, I would be better off using this mechanical Anubarak, or I'd be better off using one of the other heroes. But overall, this was very well polished from a faction perspective. I really liked the overlay, the goblin overlay, and the different units. I really liked the turrets as well, and how you needed a different builder to make the turrets, which I thought was interesting. And I did tower spam because I thought that the turrets were some of the most satisfying things to build at the end of the day, but I had fun with that. The tanks not being able to attack buildings, I'm not sure if that was intentional, but I assume so. I don't know why they couldn't. But the tanks were cool looking, and they were very strong, and I liked those. But again, I think there was like one or two roles in this goblin faction that just weren't filled, specifically like a tank frontliner. Not the literal tank, but like a melee frontliner. And then further, it did feel like the casters were relatively weak. But that might just be because I've played so many custom campaigns where the casters explicitly were the strongest units possible to use. So maybe in this case they were actually just more balanced and my expectations were a little off. The enemy base was super hard to push into. I needed to tower spam it. But I think that this was just a built-in script. But this probably could have stood to just have more, you know, a more custom touch on how the enemy functioned. And then lastly, I think the entire upper right of the map was was an area that you didn't need to go to. And I think I did get a Crown of Kings up there, so I guess I wouldn't really complain. And also you can get an expansion. I think this map also did really well in giving the player an opportunity to actually mess around and build their stuff. And really, you know, if there was one thing to change, it would probably be, you know, how the enemy functions. To kind of, you know, keep the player more on their toes, but also not be... It kind of went... It was like a pendulum. It was either like they were non-existent or they sent large attacks and their home base was so well defended that you needed to tower spam it, right? There was no in-between, and I think that this could benefit from figuring out a way to, you know, give it a little bit of a white glove touch so that it did have more of an in-between. But ultimately, I like this faction, and I'd like to see more from it, and I like the concept of, you know, being able to use different heroes almost in a melee sense, but not quite, more like strategically based on what you're facing in that given map. So that was cool. Misadventures of Hercules. I'll start with what I didn't like, which was one thing. It was a little too long. Everything else about this map I thought was excellent. Vengeful Strudel did submit last year, and it was The Labors of Hercules. This was just a direct sequel to it, and this was a map, though, where I do say it was too long for the contest. It wasn't too long for just a map, simply because it was fun to play, and I wanted to get to the end. I didn't feel like, oh, well, it's been an hour, I should probably stop. No, I really particularly enjoyed this one. And that's why I sort of kept going, even though I was trying to make excuses to stop, but then subconsciously I'm like, nah, but I don't want to finish it. I gotta be close to the end, right? 1 hour later, he finishes it, after he was halfway done. The most impressive thing here was that there were 7 heroes. Well, there were 8 if you include Hercules, but the fact that the map was balanced around having all these different combinations was, I think, extremely impressive. So I would compare it almost to Dude Keys in that way, where like there was no way I could show off all these combinations, but the fact that you know that they exist makes a huge difference with how I look at this campaign. And here's the thing, even if the only 3 heroes were Hercules, Mog, and the Lost Probarak, even if those were the 3 that you were mandated, this map was excellent. Like, all the boss battles were well balanced. Nothing felt like bullshit. All of the engagements felt cleverly crafted to make you think about how you approach them. But then on top of that, imagine that they were still clever around all these different combinations of units. So again, I didn't play them all, so I can't say they were all balanced per se, but there was a note that there were a bunch of testers that tried them out to ensure that in some way they worked. And I will say, like, Probarak, for example, really fragile but extremely overpowered against bosses. There were many times where he was dead, but the cannon stayed up and basically finished the boss for me. But I don't think that was necessarily a balance. The balance issue, the way that it was addressed, was the fact that he died super quick. So you had to get those cannons down in the first place before he was killed. And so just to imagine that all the bosses were built, or the heroes were built, I'm not sure which one was built first and which one was built second, but it was done in a way that, such that it was to accommodate for the fact that, you know, this is a clever boss mechanic or an engagement mechanic, but you also have all these combinations of heroes that you could possibly have at that time. And I think that was probably the most impressive thing for me. And again, this fits the theme of wanting more, you know, knowing that there's more, not just because I want to see another Hercules map, but because there were so many hero combinations that I want to mess around with and use, and the fact that you could upgrade all of them at different tiers, similar to like how Tychus works in co-op. When I realized that, it was kind of one of those where it's like, oh my god, I can get all these different heroes. Oh my god, I can get all these different hero abilities. Oh my god, I can upgrade the different abilities to different tiers, and oh my god, there's an ultimate level of each one. It's just sort of built and built and built. And the last boss, I think the one that you're seeing right here, was fitting because he was genuinely challenging, and I had to restart a couple times, and I liked how, like, even his basic attack was very easy to dodge at the beginning, and then at the end, if you don't realize it, he starts tracking where you're moving and will predict where you're going and shoot the projectile so you walk into it. Like that stuff like that, where again it starts easy and builds to that level, and then you have to use your brain to an extent, but then also react mechanically. It was really well done. So overall, this had a lot of strong points. Obviously, it was long, and the reason that I put 60 to 70 minutes judge time on the rule set is simply because I can't. Deltron and I can't play 28 submissions that are each 2 hours apiece. It has to be. There has to be some way to limit that stuff. You have to. It's just, there has to be a limit, right? So even just looking at the first 60 to 70 minutes of this and, discarding the last boss stuff that I had talked about, it still has all the strong points that I had listed, which was clever mechanics, clever boss fights, and just huge replayability because of all the hero combinations. All right, on to the next one. Macguffin Destruction. So this one was wacky. I think that there were, unfortunately, a lot of things wrong with this, but it was almost entirely focused around the fact that they were spawned waves. If there were no spawned waves, I think this would have been okay. And I think he said he added spawned waves because the AI, like the built-in scripted AI, didn't work the way he wanted it to, so he spawned units instead. You can still spawn units, just don't have as many spawn, and don't use siege tanks that will siege up and then sit there and not move, right? So because we ran into like a big ball of siege tanks at one point. This, again, fits with the theme of wanting more, because I had no flippin' clue what to do, other than destroy the cannon. There were apparently like 8 or 9 endings, and I didn't find any of them. But it all revolved around those power things. So there were a couple things on this map that simply just didn't work, and that was the problem. It wasn't that it was designed poorly, it was that it was executed poorly because the triggers just outright didn't fire for me. So there were supposed to be hints that would pop up, or like indications of like what you were supposed to do with certain neutral buildings. I didn't get those. Further, I believe the Peach faction and the Blue faction are not supposed to be hostile to you until you cross a certain threshold. Now, they were hostile to me right away. So it might have been because, I think because they were attackable, maybe just make them outright neutral so that your units won't automatically attack them either, and it won't set them off to being hostile. Right? It's supposed to be a conflict between those two, and you're in the middle, and until you're ready to act, they should leave you alone. That's what was intended for the map. And again, this is a situation similar to a few others where I've mentioned, like, I know what it was supposed to be, but I can't judge it based on what it's supposed to be. I have to judge it based on what I played. But regardless, I do want to share with you all, to fit with the theme of, wanting more, seeing what's next. I finished this map and I was like, that was busted as shit, but holy hell do I want to know what was I supposed to do with all those neutral buildings. And so I went into SCM Draft and I looked and I talked to Zetsupachi on the Discord and he explained it, and so even though it was broken, I had an interesting time with it. And if you can leave the player questioning and wanting more without being outright completely confused, like I had a general sense of what the heck was supposed to do, but none of it really worked. Again, it was there, it was on the cusp, but it just wasn't finished, unfortunately, or it just didn't work the way it was intended to. But it was interesting nonetheless. So good effort. Before Darkness Falls, this one was visually stunning, just with the way that and just sort of presentation. This one definitely takes the cake in terms of presentation, even though you got like the Jimmy Smith's face plastered on there. It was kind of silly, but that was the only thing visually. Everything else was crisp and clean, and the system that was implemented here worked really, really well. Now, this is hard to describe because the gameplay itself, you have the strategic layer of like an XCOM, but the gameplay itself, when you're actually on the planet, did feel a bit lacking. And that's why, at the end of the day, this one, again, presentation-wise, was stunning. It's absolutely stunning. But what it lacked, again, was it felt almost... Again, I can't say it any other way. It felt almost like a mobile game, in the sense of, like, you're shuffling through menus, right? And then you kind of deploy them, and then you sort of a-click your way through the missions. Now, one thing I do realize, though, is that this was the demo with the first 3 missions, so there's a bunch of equipment that you'd get later that would allow you to use abilities, etc., etc. So, keeping with the theme, I am so excited to see this expanded so that Deltron and I can play more of it, because I really want to play more missions, because, again, it was absolutely stunning, very crisp and clean. The UI, when you're making a system like this, is extremely important, and this absolutely nailed it with how responsive all the menus were. And one thing I'd look back on is, like, for example, StarCraft Universe, very intense project, and what it lacked was a crisp and clean menu system, because there was a lot of menu swapping and a lot of gear and stuff like that. So, you know, when I play stuff like this, I compare it back to StarCraft Universe as just an example, which was you know, how crisp. That's why I keep using that word, how responsive and crisp do these things tend to be. But I like the scavenging mechanic, you know, having to pick and choose, you know, when to scavenge stuff with your SCV. We completely bombed a mission, which I thought was funny, and we did get to save all of our units, even though they got killed. I think that was just based on the difficulty we were playing on. So, you know, at the end of the day, I can't wait to play more of this. That's really the last thing I have to say about it. Again, it's a lot of menu shuffling, and I think if you have the tactical layer, which is what we're looking at here, versus the strategic layer, if you make it so that the tactical layer, you know, just more missions and more equipment to use, more active interaction with the player beyond the menuing, this has so much to offer, and I'm really looking forward to playing more of it. All right, next one. Alter Fates by Adriano, the infamous Reavers. I spent 20 to 30 minutes just on this one section, and I think it doesn't require a lot to change it. The problem is the Reavers, as you can see, it only takes 2 scarabs to kill your hero, and they shoot really quick. So even if you use the hero with the shield, you turn the shield on, you get shot by them once, you move in, you take a shot at one of them, whatever. The shield is broken. Even if you heal and you're back at full health, they shoot fast enough that you can't get in, use an ability, and back up before they shoot twice. So in 2 rounds, even if you use the shield, you're dead. So this was, I think, again, the way the Overlord is placed, it's just, there's no trick to it. That's part of it, too, is I look at these engagements that Adriano makes, and sometimes you gotta grind it, or you gotta find the trick. There's no way to grind through this by, like, cloaking, moving in, pecking away, backing out, cloaking, going in, pecking away, backing out, which was a lot of the rest of the map. But you can't do that there because of the detection. So the grind option is gone. The only other option then is finding a trick to it, and there is no trick to it. That's the problem. It's just, I mean, you could watch all 30 minutes I spent on this. I didn't cut any of it out. It's just wild. So I think, you know, the mildest of terrain changes, that bonfire and the pillar placement, makes it so that you can't get in and engage only one of the Reavers. And there's other ways to do it, but it feels more like you have to exploit your way through it as opposed to strategize your way through it. So when you have encounters like this, I would encourage people who are thinking through it to figure out, again, better ways to make sure that the player doesn't feel like they're exploiting it, because then again, I'm thinking, was this intended? I think it's more about making sure that the player understands that there is a way that you can strategize through it. And the other thing was, too, you know, if you had all your consumables or not. So I talked about that a lot in the actual engagement, in the actual video itself. But you know, so I don't have to go over it necessarily. But, you know, there are very minor things that could be changed to make this, I think, more approachable. But the rest of the map was interesting, and it was, I think, typical Adriano, which is hard. It's hard. And it might take some reloads to get through certain encounters. It might take some grinding to get through some encounters. But the boss fight also, which I can skip to in the next video, was fun, and it was typical Adriano, which is, you know, very fast-paced and don't stand in the fire. And making sure that you have just enough consumables, just enough to get through it. And I think that's what Adriano does well, is makes you realize, like, oh man, if I only had one more heal or one more grenade, I could do it. So you feel kind of encouraged to go back and do it again so you can get to the boss with one more heal or one more grenade, and then you can beat it. And I think that's well designed. All right, next. Halloween at Pottsfield by Cools. This, I don't know how I would describe this, maybe more point and click. Like, it's like a puzzle map, but not. And this I felt very strongly about the wanting more, wanting to know what's next aspect of it. I came away with it thinking like, man, there were probably so many more recipes or so many more units that I could have found. You know, I completed 3 of the 4 or 2 of the 3 bonus objectives. The one I couldn't finish, it was because there were reagents that I couldn't find. One of which was a random spawn, which I just got unlucky. So once I looked at a spot, I thought I could only get one type of reagent there, but in fact, it would spawn a different reagent over time. So maybe telegraph that to the player or put those in a spot where the player has no choice but to reveal them every so often. Because, like, for example, I think I got the Wolfsbane a bunch, but those had the opportunity to spawn spider parts, and that's what I was missing. There was also a reagent that the zombies made. When you built a zombie, you could push a button, they would die, and you could get the zombified essence. I couldn't find that for the life of me. And the reason was because the button in the command card looked like disease clouds. So, number one, I thought, okay, well, zombies would have disease cloud. That's normal. And it's the disease cloud icon, and that's a passive. So I never even moused over it because I didn't realize it was a usable ability. So that's partly my fault and partly telegraphing from the creator, which is something I talked about when on the Freezing Acid Rain Stukov-esque Infested Terran faction map, right? So it's like, I realize it was my mistake, but it's also describing why I made the mistake so that the creators can choose if they want to try to figure out a way to compensate for it or not. But overall, this was just a really clever map. It was silly, it was funny, it had voice acting, again, that felt over the top, but it was fun. And a very, very, like, memey map, but also it made me want to keep playing it. And that was probably the biggest takeaway here, was, like, the cauldron mechanic made me want to keep experimenting and trying more. And every time I made something new, it was just, you know, made me smile. And so I think that was probably the strongest point. There was a huge amount of unused space on this map, and I'm not sure if that was only because he wanted to make a jack-o'-lantern that the player couldn't see, unless they used the vision cheat. I'm not sure. But yeah, that was the only thing, is like, it kind of messes with the player's expectations for how long the map is going to be. Not that that's something that's necessarily important. That's only important to me from a video making perspective. So just to contextualize that, that's not really that important. But overall, yeah, I liked all the different mechanics and the side quests, and there was more in the town to do. You can mess around with the Gravekeepers. I never did that. So again, this I think was probably, this one was really fitting that theme of what's next. And so I think I've seen talk, I'm not sure if this is a joke or not, but he's working on like a Christmas at Pottsfield. I'm not sure. But just this idea that like Pottsfield and all these different scenarios and like a goofy Halloween or seasonal thing is exciting and fun. So this was, again, it was like a goofy, lighthearted, but very fun submission that made me want to find more. And when I finished, even though I won, I still felt like there was more to find. And that's great. It's a great feeling. Alright, so heading to Darkest Hour by Necron. This was StarCraft Remastered. This used custom scripts, and I liked how this was curated. This was curated to force the player into working with limited space and limited resources, and I thought that was cool because it was a macro map, but it felt extremely tactical with limited units. So like you could build more, and you think like, why I can't build an army like I should be able to. It's a macro map, but you just can't quite get there. And again, that's because of the terrain design and the resource placement. I think was very well thought out. So, like, if there was anything that could be kind of described as like a puzzle macro experience, this is sort of it. And I think that this sort of idea is what a lot of macro real-time strategy is missing, which is, again, curated experiences, where the mechanics as you expect them are still there, but you can only interact with them in a way that is different than what you might expect. I'm not sure a better way to describe that, but again, it's like the mechanics are still the same. You still have resources, you still have the ability to build units, but you might not have the space or the resources to accomplish what you know you need to right away. And that stops it from being just another, okay, I have a command center and 4 SCVs. The enemy has some pre-placed defense. You know, now I'm going to get some tanks, and I'm going to move up, and I'm going to take my expand, etc., right? It's typically the same formula in many cases. How do you change that? Map events, customized tech tree, and then I think what this mission does, which is different than most every other macro experience that I've seen, because a lot we got were tech tree changes. This also has tech tree changes, but I didn't get to see a lot of them because it was curated both in terms of resources and terrain to stop you from getting there. But that's what this map did. I think that a lot of others didn't, which is, again, that third way to sort of manipulate the player into playing Build and Destroy differently, and I thought that was cool. Now, I would have liked to see what the UED faction had, but I didn't have space to build a factory and a starport, and the one that I had was killed, for example. But I saw some stuff like the EMP Trooper. Seems like when it gets destroyed, it blows up in an EMP explosion, which seems like it would be amazing against Protoss, for example. So there's more stuff like that. So again, wanting more. What's next? And this is part of the UED AIP project that Necron's working on. What this map, I think, needed more of was maybe more of a white glove with the AI scripts, because the way that they attacked that bottom right Cerebrit, just like I talked about in the video, was I don't feel like it was intended, and it was partly just a randomization issue, and so that was I think that was just an issue at the end of the day with the way that you need to defend that Cerebrit. Either just where the Cerebrit is placed or how the enemy attacks it needs to be more well, curated, I guess, which is funny because, again, I consider that the high point of the map. So, but I recognize the strong part of the map, but also, you know, you lose your hero. I guess that's because he goes to get infested. I was thinking, like, maybe if you'd let the player keep their hero, that could be cool too on this map. But ultimately, the only issue I had, which was the Cerebrit placement and the way that the enemies attacked it in, like, you know, 40-50 supply, and you needed a huge amount of units down there to stop them, versus the rest of your base being virtually left alone. So I'm not sure if that's been addressed, but I did talk about it a lot in my original playthrough, so you can go and check that out as well. But overall, good submission, and I thought the mechanic where you could mess around with the Protoss as well and give them gas was cool. It felt like it was just enough. Like, if it was any more than that, I'd been like, no, this is bullshit. But when you can get the Protoss as allies, that makes a huge difference as well. So map events, look at that. So that's, you know, incorporating all these different ways to diversify your macro build and destroy experience on this map. All right, next thing. Good Morning Demon by Ducky the Duck. This map, I had a smile on my face the whole time. I think that the way that it's balanced could certainly be changed. I think the enemy gets way too many medics. Oh, this was right at the end. I think the enemy gets way too many medics that build up. And there's a lot of gotcha moments, and I think some of the super units like the Thors have so much HP and armor. It does feel a little over the top, but I think that the mechanics, like the core fundamentals of the map, are so good and so fun. The three heroes are really well designed. They have really interesting abilities. And I think the ultimate abilities are so satisfying to use, both visually and just strength-wise against enemies. Is really, really solid. I think the medics, though, in general, like, they're just really strong. Like, they maybe could have a reduced healing rate, or just simply give the enemy fewer of them, would make a big, big difference. But it's definitely a tug-of-war map, as you're constantly pushing through. The enemy has a lot of tools at their disposal, so you can't just steamroll it. It's hard. It's not an easy map. But I was really impressed by how fun each of the heroes seemed, and I would have liked to try all of them. You know, obviously I only had an opportunity to play as the demon character, but Deltron and Alarak both seemed like they had a good time. Part of the problem too is you saw there, like, it popped up and said, do you want weapons, armor, or like special? Partly it's just like I didn't fully understand my role until later on in the map, and this is another example where it's like I recognize that's my problem, but maybe Duckies would consider a better way to telegraph to the player, like, hey, if you're demon, you're the tank. If you're seer, you're the utility hero. If you're Eidolon, you're the DPS ranged auto attack hero. So that way, when you get this pop-up, later on the map, I'm like, anytime I put points into weapons, it felt wasted. I just felt like, basically at the end, I felt like I had wasted a lot of my ability points, and I would have liked to respec them. Now, I don't know if there was I don't think so. I'm pretty sure that the respec wasn't an option, but that might have been nice at the end. I would have liked to respec pretty much all my assigned points. The only other thing, too, you can see is that the fire guy, make him a little more visually distinct, because he looks too much like a marauder, and you might not realize how strong he is until it's way too late. But yeah, overall, like, this was really solid, and there were really clever mechanics where you had to, like, go around and destroy generators, and you had to infest these barracks to help you push through with the infested Terrans. And I get that the medics are strong to stop the infested Terrans from winning for you. So it is kind of a fine line that you have to tread. Fine line that you have to kind of follow here to make sure that the tug of war still stays solid, but also make sure that the player doesn't get to an unwinnable position, right? There were times where when the enemy built up to a certain point, there was just no, you were just done. There was just no way that you could push them back at all. And I guess maybe that's intended as well. But partially it's before you even realize where you're supposed to go or what you're supposed to do, and you realize how strong the medics are. That happened to us a couple times, though I will say the end of this playthrough was, it was a real roller coaster. Again, I had a smile on my face pretty much the whole time, even when I was dead. So if you didn't watch this one, you got to go check it out, especially like the last 25% of it. It was just bananas. The only other thing too is I do feel like I only played the demon. I can't speak for the other two, but like my W ability felt pretty much worthless. Partially because the broodlings just, I mean, not to get it, it's too specific to get into this, but like the broodlings were like way too weak. Maybe remove the light tag from them so that the firebats didn't kill them instantly. But like I was like, why would I? What a waste! What a waste of ability points. So that's what I mean with like the possibility to respec. So maybe those orbs that give you like a bonus, maybe make it like one of them allows you to respec at some point, like give you the option to do it, or it gives you like a one-time buff. Like you have the opportunity to either respec or you get the buff that allows you to push better with the tug of war, for example. But this was a weird example of one where like I can easily point out a lot of things that were wrong with it, but it was so much fun. Like even though I was like, okay, the amount of medics is bullshit. I had so much fun the whole time. It was almost like it's like lightning in a bottle. So I'm looking forward to seeing. The map was clearly only about a third done, and there's a bunch in the fog of war, and this was like the demo of it. So I'm gonna be very happy to play more of this. Definitely play it with 3 people. You can't play it by yourself. You'll definitely lose. So make sure you get a group. It's on the StarCraft 2 arcade. Good submission, duckies. All right, next. An Icy Foothold by Mu B Newbie. This one was cool just because it had a different mechanic. This was another one where it was simple but relatively elegant. It took one core idea. It was kind of like a dungeon crawler RPG-esque. Like you do the bonus objectives, you get a little power boost so you can go to the next one. You get a little power boost to go to the next one, right? But the fundamental idea here was that your units respawned, and the timers were relatively short, right? The timers were long enough so that you weren't getting instant reinforcements to help you push through something, but you were getting them fast enough that you didn't feel like it was a grindy experience. So I talked about this in the video, is that what that does is it allows you, the mapmaker, to know exactly how much the player will have in terms of units at any given moment. And so you can build your encounters around that, knowing that, oh, well, maybe this guy lost 4 ghouls, so I can't make an encounter that, would be too hard because they might have lost a bunch. So you see this, I think, in a lot of micro missions specifically, where the concept is basically the rich get richer. If you get through enough of a micro mission without losing anything, you're gonna steamroll the rest of it, because you realize that the creators typically are having to account for the fact that, oh, well, this hard encounter in the middle, you might have lost a lot. Therefore, I have to make this encounter compensate for the fact that I assume players lost a bunch earlier in the map. But if you didn't lose a lot in the middle, it's over. There's no challenge anymore. This concept of the respawning units, I think, is really novel. It might have been unintentional. I don't know if this was, in mind or not, but it's novel in the sense that you can design encounters knowing that every player approaching them will have the same resources at that time. So I think that's really cool and could be explored a lot more by anyone, really. And I like the hero. I liked his ultimate specifically. That was really cool. And overall, I'm not sure why the map was in fog instead of total darkness, but regardless, this was a cool map, and it was incremental progress. You get a little bump in power, you go to the next one, and there's a satisfaction in checking off your objectives and getting stronger and stronger. That's why RPGs are popular. All right, on to the next one. Part-Time Alliance. I was supposed to play this in Brood War. Whoops. I was supposed to have medics. I didn't know that. This one was just so unforgiving, mostly because you couldn't save. And I don't think that there was from what I understand from DK's comment, is he didn't make it so you couldn't save for the sake of not saving. You couldn't save because this map used EUDs, which is a special type of triggering. If you're unfamiliar, I don't really need to go into it, but basically, he wanted to use these certain EUD triggers, and that is what disables saving. The question is, it's hard, is it worth it to disable saves, especially on a map that is very clearly meant to be like a challenge, like impossible type map? I wasn't able to complete this map. I think I could have, maybe. You know, I had a few bad encounters where I got stormed or I got shot by a Reaver, and the problem is, like that one right there. Like, I didn't have time to react, partially because I'm not a fast enough player, but partially it was just, I just didn't even see it at that moment. So, you know, maybe you would reload there. But because you can't, well, look, we're already at the cheat part. But because you can't reload, it's discouraging. The hero was really strong. I really liked Rose. Lockdown was just absolutely crucial for carriers, for Reavers, and it seemed like Rose did full damage to everything, and it wasn't just the ghost concussive damage. You could use her, it's named Rose, to destroy buildings and such, so that was cool. But again, this was definitely like a challenge map, and part of it was just my expectations were totally subverted. I didn't know what to expect here. So when I finally realized, like, oh, we can only make infantry, and the Protoss tech, not only are they out-leveling you in terms of upgrades, but they can get to 4-4 and 4-4-4, and you can only get up to 3-3. And really, you can only get up to 1-1, but you can get to 3-3 if you capture the science facility. So this one incorporates that idea of map events. Map events, change it up. And the altered tech tree, changed up. Right? So that's 2 of the 3. And I guess in a way, this does curate an experience in the sense that I would say it's not that it's an altered tech tree, it's curated in the sense that all your tech is disabled and you can only make infantry. So it's definitely unique in that way, but it's certainly not fair, but I don't think it was supposed to be. But, you know, I mean, I hate to focus on one thing, but the inability to save really, again, it was just discouraging. It just felt discouraging because I would have liked to beat this, but there was no way I was going to restart and do it all again. And also the fact that there were findables like map events, I thought that was cool too. I liked the science vessel, making it so that you could get to 3-3 and then you could get those creatures, which I didn't find until too late, but that was interesting. So again, interesting submission. Unfortunately, I just couldn't do it. Couldn't complete it. Breakout by Super Muds. So this was like a third person with Tychus and a group of people. So this was a vast improvement, I think, over Super Muds' submission last year, where really last year I think the issue with it was the camera. This issue this year, I had no issues with the camera. I know Deltron had like one bug that messed up his camera, but like there were no persistent camera issues, right? There was like a game-breaking bug with the camera later, but assuming that like something like that is fixed, this is all like it was relatively smooth. One thing that we had pointed out is, you know, get the extra text off the screen. Like what you're seeing right now, it's very challenging to see the game itself. The buttons were too big, and I think I saw in the Discord Super Muds posted a screenshot where he had made all those a lot smaller. So that's really useful. The other thing too is on the loading screen or on the arcade screen is make it so that the players can see who they're choosing. Let the players see who, like, you know, which hero are they picking at the time. That would be really nice, and like what role they're going to be. And I think Deltron just didn't understand like what his hero did, like how his damage worked, and I think Super Muds described it in the comments. But if it's that challenging to see, maybe make it so that it's more visually distinct, right? That could certainly help. But like me playing as Tychus was really satisfying. I really liked just, you know, shooting the lasers and just melting enemies. That was really cool. And we made it. I think we made it. How far did we go? Yeah, about 30 minutes. And we got to a boss who just, I guess because Deltron had a camera issue, but we just had no way to stop him. What was cool here, too, though, is that you had your whole squad, and even if you couldn't play with a whole group, they were AI controlled, they used their abilities correctly. So overall, this worked, I think, mostly as intended, and if we didn't have that one camera issue, that was the only unfortunate thing. But this was pretty cool. Visually, it needs some work. Again, just make that stuff a little smaller. You don't need the pop-ups. Or maybe you could add the pop-ups, but reduce them to like this part of the screen, right? The player doesn't need them in the middle here, just sort of bloating up the experience in their main viewport. But overall, this is one where, again, it's just like mild changes. You don't need to do a lot, but it would be a really interesting and fun, and the fact that you can play with, I think, up to 5 people is pretty solid. All right. Loco Origin by Masked Imposter. This one was goofy. Masked Imposter is known for making community-oriented maps, and I don't really have much one way or the other to say on this. I think the humor was on point, as it usually is for Masked Imposter. It'd be cool if Loco saw this this map. I think Mast had said that he got Loco to play like a small portion of it at one point, but he wasn't able to play the whole thing. But like again, the humor, like the community-based humor, was on point, both with the dialogue, but all the tool tips and all the abilities themselves. It was solid, and it was a fun like dungeon crawly type experience, right? Because you could only control Loco, and then you fought, like, you had Falcon Paladin who would guide you along, and then you had to fight Taste Toastus. Like, that was interesting stuff. So, clever use, I think, of leveling a hero. So, like, you could see he's level 2 down here. So, like, being able to actually level up, and you get new abilities that are presented properly along the way. And also, Mast, being a game design, like an actual game designer himself, I think thinks a lot more about some quality of life stuff that some people might not, for like a more general audience and accessibility. So, like, for example, like a respawn mechanic. I think some people outright would say, oh, you know, if you can't win, if you need a respawn mechanic, then you're just not good enough, right? That is an example of someone who just doesn't really think about these things. Or maybe they do, but they don't care, they don't recognize the importance. Being able to recognize that stuff is important from like a game design perspective if you're going to go to the next level of actually trying to access a general audience for like more like games made in Unity, for example, which Mast has done. So with that in mind, it does allow, it takes more time though to incorporate that kind of stuff. So I'm not saying everything needs a respawn mechanic, not everything needs a second chance, but you have to be careful and judicial when you're designing stuff to say, should I? Right? In the example of StarCraft 2, if the player is not actively quick-saving because there's no auto-saving, a respawn mechanic is a blessing. And in fact, it helped here because... it helped here because I didn't have to rewind when I died. I was just like, hey, don't worry, you'll respawn. And this is the perfect map to incorporate that type of quality of life implementation, I think, in my opinion, is to have a respawn mechanic, is this type of map. So for people that won't do that, I understand why you might not because of like a time issue, for example. But from like a design issue, like for like trying to justify why you shouldn't do it besides time, I don't think there's really a good argument per se for like a map like this one. But again, that's definitely up for debate. And but I think again, Masta is typically on point with those types of ideas. All right. Next one. Seals of Cratoir. You know what? I totally gave up on the whole, like, I'm going to give little awards to each one for a different thing. So I'm sorry for everyone up until this point where I was probably thinking about this, but I didn't mention it. Because this one in particular, I would say this was the best custom faction. Just unique custom faction. So in terms of, like, tech tree changes on that particular sub mechanic of like a conversion-esque type thing. This map did it the best just because they were so unique and they really changed the way you played. So I think this map unfortunately didn't have like the wrappings, right? It didn't have like an interesting actual map with like a you attack into some orc bases, you get a bunch of uncontrollable allies that can pretty much win for you. But in terms of like exploration, there were Easter eggs, you could find some new units. And I really, really enjoyed a lot of the cool stuff you could build later on here. Now, the problem is this was like a demo sandbox, right? So I can't really think about this when I'm judging, but it was in the map, and I really, really liked this Technic faction, and also being to mess around with the Elven faction as well. So there's a lot to this that I really, really want to play more with. I think the map itself, it didn't provide enough to... Like, I think it was a disservice, the fact that the map didn't let you actually utilize a lot of this stuff. I mean, you could at the end in, like, this sandboxy area, but really just, like, this area down here, you know, more terrain detail, for example, but, like, I really like the hero. I love the trap ability. I like the rain of arrows. It all visually looked cool. Again, this definitely, without a doubt, was at the top in terms of like custom faction uniqueness, and I want to play around more with it. Now, obviously, that's going to require more delicate use of how like enemies work, because it's so different with what the player has to work with that it's not as easy as just dumping them into like a vanilla experience, right? Because the player has totally different tools at their disposal, so it's gonna, I think, take a lot more testing. But yeah, this map, what it came down to is, you get some units and you get to mess around with them, but then you just attack into these buildings, these big blobs of blue buildings. Now, in terms of like a first mission for a campaign, it's quite fitting. But for the contest, I would have liked more opportunities. And the only reason I'm saying that is because I thought that this faction was so interesting. I genuinely wanted like a better opportunity to use them, if that makes sense. So I'm not trying to be disparaging for the sake of it. It's more like I liked this so much that I wanted the ability to actually, I mean, even just like a, give the player a base and attack into an orc base that sends units at them, I think would have been, would have done more justice, just because I just wanted more of this. So it's interesting because like the only negative thing I have to say comes from the fact that I liked it so much. So it's kind of a unique situation, right? I wouldn't have anything bad to say if I wasn't so intrigued by wanting to play more with this group. All right, and then the last one was Icy Trenches by Raging Balliste. It's been so long. Like, I've been recording for so long, my brain's starting to melt. But again, this is the last one, so let's focus. This was extremely unique. Looks better than Warcraft 3 Reforged, if you ask me. But the whole concept of how the Dwarven factions worked, it's weird. I don't know how to describe this properly, so I'm trying to kind of collect my thoughts on it. Like, this is a system that was so interesting and so in-depth, but I feel like I didn't really scratch the surface of it, if that makes sense. Like, at the end of the day, then we were just really holding out against the Zerg, and we had allies. But the fact that there were so many other factions on the map, I felt like maybe I missed something, like there was supposed to be some sort of diplomacy to this. But I'm not sure, right? And this definitely felt more city builder-esque in the sense that you needed to creep with the steam houses and the way that the economy worked. It was a lot slower. So it felt like combat wasn't meant to be as fast-paced. And that's why this was an interesting map, because it purposefully blended the StarCraft and Warcraft mechanics, or even not even Warcraft. I would say like a city builder, or like a grand strategy type game, right? You had a lot to take care of across the map, but like the StarCraft action was happening really, 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 really fast. So like you had to kind of combine both of those, which is quite stressful actually. But I liked the ammunition mechanic. I guess to kind of sort of simplify my thoughts, I thought the ammunition mechanic was really cool, and that way you weren't focused on the front lines of fighting, you were focused on your supply lines. And the reason why, ultimately, I think it wasn't as good as it could have been was because if you're focusing on supply lines, that means that the terrain and the placement, design of, like, the bases and stuff is extremely important. And it was very cramped, so, like, if I wanted to go back and forth, ferrying ammunition to give to my allies, I couldn't do it because those big tanks, I forget what they were called, that you can see one in the middle of the map right there, they couldn't fit, right? So, like, in one place you have a battle line and then a base to get to it, but unfortunately it was so smashed in there, I couldn't move my units to where they needed to be. Now, on the other hand, that could have been intentional to ensure that the Zerg essentially pushed through at a proper rate, because it is a holdout map and is a timer eventually. So I understand that's a challenging thing to balance, right? Like, I, the player, wanted more liberal access to being able to support my allies. But on the other hand, if I could have done that too well, then the Zerg wouldn't have been able to push through and actually keep pressure on me, the player. So it's sort of like a difficulty balance on one hand, but I don't know, it's charming. I had a charm to it with the Dwarven bases and all these different factions. Like, look at the mini-map. Again, it looks like a diplomacy map from the arcade, but it's not. That's the only thing, is I feel like there should have been like some sort of extra mechanic to this that maybe wasn't finished, or I just didn't find it. There was this whole thing where, like, you could agree to let them keep their mines, or you could take them. I'm not sure what effect that had on anything, besides maybe I could have gotten some extra money. But at the end of the day, I did barely win. So, and I think that's how it was supposed to turn out. So in a way, it was sort of curated and planned in that way. But ultimately, this was really cool. Once again, the theme was really all about wanting more, wanting to see more. What's next, right? Some of these maps and some of these creators I had not even heard of before. Like Raging Ballista, unless you have a different handle on YouTube or on my Discord under a different name, I had not known that you had made anything in the past. But if this is part of like a project where you've made more, this is so cool. Also, as far as I can tell, there was no way to get a victory trigger on this map. It was only defeat. And that's not really a good or a bad thing in my opinion. I just think is different. It's interesting, that's for sure. Okay, so that's all of our entries. I'll just go ahead and pause here. I really don't have an outro for this. I think I'm just going to go ahead and end because this has been quite long. But I hope you've enjoyed. Please leave your feedback for any of these maps that you want below. I'd love to hear from some of the creators if they have anything more to add. I hope I did these maps justice as a judge, right? This is all amateur stuff. I'm an amateur video creator. You're all amateur map makers. Amateur being, you know, we're not getting paid for this. We're just doing it in our free time. We're having fun. And that's what this contest has always been. You know, for the 2 people that are still listening through this hour-and-a-half video, I will make this final point, which is, you know, this has always just been an encouragement to get involved and have fun, not just from the creator's perspective, but from the viewer's perspective too. Like, I want you all to vote in the community poll when it comes out. I want you all to leave encouraging feedback for creators, what they can improve on and what you liked. And that's what gets more people to make stuff. I talked about this at the end of Masked Imposter's showcase video, but I'll just reiterate it here. Is, you know, Maporino's just, if you want to make something, it's only competitive for the people that want to be competitive, right? No one's, I don't think, at least from the comments I've seen, nobody's been actively trying to put people down or make fun of you just because you made something and it was your first map. In fact, I think it's the opposite. Most people are encouraging, and that's what I'm trying to encourage, is a welcoming community that gets people involved, because that positivity is what leads people to actually make more stuff. So it's not being positive in a fake artificial way just to do it, just to say like, oh, everyone be nice to each other. No, there's a reason for it. When you have a welcoming community, you bring in more people who are more active and more willing to make stuff, right? And we've gotten a lot of good stuff with that demeanor, and I'd like to encourage that and keep that up. So Maporino, again, there's clearly tiers, right? There's a group of people who submitted because they think they can win, they want to win, and they're competing amongst each other. And then there's pretty much everyone else who are unashamed to be in that category, who are like, I'm going to submit this because I had fun making it. It's going to be cool to see Jayborino play it. It's going to be cool to see what other people have to say about it. I don't care if I win. And that's the group I want to focus on, because the people that want to compete will submit anyway, and I'm happy to have them keep coming back because they always submit the best stuff and it's a blast to play. And then the rest of the stuff I also enjoy playing just to kind of see what wacky stuff we get, and like what, you know, it's just, again, a lot of it is elegant and interesting, and just to see how it all kind of comes out. Again, we had 28 submissions. That's a ton for a contest that only lasts 2 months. It's part of like a niche gaming genre, right? RTS is niche by itself, but then you have people making some genres within that based on the tools available to them. You know, you would expect virtually no one is watching this, but it's just cool to see that it's still like an active community, and we all kind of get along around this mutually shared interest. So again, you know, join me in encouraging that type of community. And it's not about not being negative per se. It's simply about recognizing that a level of honesty, but also positivity does encourage more stuff being made. And that's kind of the whole point. I made these videos because I like playing this stuff and I want more of it. And the best way to do that is to encourage people to participate. And you, the viewer, can help too by leaving feedback, going to Hive Workshop, going to SE2 Mapster, joining the Discords, what have you, and you know, getting the smallest amount involved and participating in some way. All right, so that's going to be that for this video, and I'll see you next time when we release the poll. So I hope you participate in that. See ya.